Thanks, Michaela. We received a number of questions directly related to your presentation, and I will just read a few of them. The first one, will the Annex 1 opt-in aircraft be validated by FAA? Does EASA have to support this validation?
Can you please repeat, Marcus? Sorry. It's there. Will the Annex 1 opt-in aircraft?
Yeah. The question is, will the Annex 1 opt-in aircraft be validated by FAA, and does EASA have to support this validation?
Okay, so let me see if I understood. So if you are asking that if an aircraft was Annex 1, so normally out of the scope, but then it's opted in, so it gets an EASA type certificate, then I would say that it should be validated by the FAA normally as any other aircraft that has been that has received a type certificate from EASA. Basically, when it comes to the airworthiness, the aircraft will just be as any normal aircraft that is in the scope.
Okay, then there was a question whether this training, this online training from EASA will be for free?
Yes, it will be for free.
That's an easy one. A more tricky one, is EASA prepared to cope with opt-ins when it comes to resources? Thanks for the question.
Well, we are as prepared as we can be. It's not like we are being flooded with requests for opt-ins. We are in the process of course, discussing the consequences of the new basic regulation with the member states. So we are in a dialogue with them, and what we have agreed is that we will deal with these opt-in cases as they appear on a pilot project basis. So once we have one of these requested, we will deal with it and together with the member state, and we will try to find ways to do it better in the future. The issue is that this is really new for us. It's really new for the member states. So at this moment, it's really difficult for us to really have a complete idea of what it means in terms of resources. Also because, like I mentioned to you, most of these opt-ins are really modular. So they really depend on what the member state will decide. The impact on resources will be very depending on that. So we are as prepared as we can be right now.
Then you talked about the European inspectors, and the question is, are they used for production organizations, design organizations, or for inspection of in-service equipment?
Well, if you are referring to the inspectors in the pool of inspectors, they are all types of inspectors. So everything that could be included, everything that is included in the scope of the regulation. So once this pool of experts will be available, then it will cover all areas under the regulation.
Since you are still there, Michaela, we have one, of course, on Brexit. And what about transfer of competent authorities? So maybe, Michaela, you could start on the transfer of competent authorities. Could this be a way to deal with Brexit? That one.
Well, the transfer of responsibilities between competent authorities is about member states. So it's a transfer of responsibilities between authorities of member states. So unfortunately, since the issue with Brexit is related to the fact that the UK will no longer be a European member state, then it will not solve the issue of Brexit.
Maybe a few words on Brexit, because of course we all know very well it's a topic we are all working very hard on. But first, just to mention that EASA is aware of your concerns, and we share your question marks, let's say, for the future. The EC and the UK government are having, as you know, very intense negotiation. And what is very important here, EASA is contributing, but is not a party per se into those negotiations. So we are following very closely what's happening. We are informed, and we are not driving the show here. So I would say, a bit sorry, we apologize in advance not to answer your questions in detail, because we are a bit like you. We are expecting a lot of things. It's coming, the deadline is coming. We provide technical inputs to the negotiators, and you know that we are one element of the big picture. So we take note of your points here. We encourage you to consult regularly the Commission websites, where they publish regularly a lot of information. There were, mid of April, you know only too well, the first communication on how could things develop. There was a bit later on in July, 19th of July, another communication. On our website, EASA, we relay those information coming from the Commission, but please accept that we are not the leading party here. In the worst case scenario, what is mentioned today on the EASA and on the Commission website is that in the worst case scenario, yes, indeed, certificates would become invalid. Now that's the worst case scenario. And we are all always prepared for the worst case scenario, but of course, we expect the best. So let's continue supporting the negotiation. I'm sure that through your business lobby group and so forth, you are extremely busy. We understand your fears, and we share some of them because we are partners. But today, that's all what we can report to you. And please, yes, just continue monitoring what is going on between the negotiators. We will keep on our website regularly information up to date as far as we know. And in any case, we expect to have a bit more clarity in the next, let's say, weeks, because time is flying. And that's unfortunately all what we can say for today. Michaela, do you want to add anything in that respect?
Not on Brexit, no. I don't want to add anything on that. Maybe I can try to answer a couple more questions. So yes, there is the information on the opt-in, on all the opt-ins and opt-outs will be provided by EASA. Once the repository of information is online, it will be included there. Until that time, because it's still going to take us some time to finalize that, we will provide this information on our website. There was also another question, since I'm talking about the repository, there was a question whether the repository's information would be available to industry, and the answer is partially. Not all information is going to be publicly available. Most of it is actually only to be shared between EASA and the member states. Brexit. There is a question about whether there is any impact on EASA DOAs outside of EU member states. Well, you will see that when it comes to DOAs, Michel will explain to you that there is really no immediate impact, because the changes that are made will require the Part 21 to be amended in any case. But once they are amended, or at least let's say at the level of the basic regulation, there is no distinction between a DOA located inside the member state or outside the member state. So at the level of the basic regulation, there is no such distinction. So if a distinction would be made, it would need to be made at the level of the implementing rules, and it would need to be justified, I guess. I don't know exactly what type of distinction you would have in mind. Fine. Which one? Well, normally, it's actually a good question, because the opt-in does not mean that there is also a transfer of competent authority. So, for example, we are mentioning police operations. Normally, since, as is the case with operations in general, the oversight will be done by the member state. So the opt-in means that the EASA rules for operations would apply, but it also means that it would be the member state that would be responsible for that oversight. The opt-in would not necessarily extend the competencies of the agency, except when it comes to the things that are already under our competence, like design, for example.
Okay, with that, I think we stop it for here, because some of the questions are also related to what Michael is going to present. I think we can address them a bit later. Thanks, Michaela. And with that, I would like to hand over to Michael Gerhardt to brief us on the updates to Part 21 in rulemaking.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to update you on what happened with Part 21 in the previous 12 months, and also give you a bit of a perspective on what is going to happen in the coming months. For that, I have prepared 3 topics, just a highlight on where we are with the different rulemaking activities and what has changed recently in the timelines of those activities. In the second part of the presentation, I will go a bit more into detail on a couple of rulemaking activities which are, in my understanding, of more interest, of higher interest for you. And I will conclude this section of the presentation with an overview of all ongoing Part 21 rulemaking activities, so that you have it at one glance to see when our proposal shall be ready, when you can expect our proposal to the European Commission, and when the Part 21 change may be expected. And then in the last part of the presentation, following up on Michaela's presentation generically on the new basic regulation, I will inform you of what we have in mind to implement from the new basic regulation in the coming months in Part 21. So if we start with the regulatory changes in the past 12 months, I would summarize them with stability. So Part 21 has not changed in the previous 12 months. The AMC and guidance material to Part 21 has been amended approximately a year ago in December 2017, where we included new guidance material on the application of the Changed Product Rule 21A101 in harmonization with our bilateral partners from the US, Canada, and Brazil. And in the same decision, you can also find a few new acceptable means of compliance for design organizations to demonstrate the qualification of lead flight test engineers. So these 2 rulemaking tasks have been concluded with that decision end of last year. But apart from that, there were in the previous 12 months no changes in the context of Part 21. But we have a couple of changes ahead of us, and Part 21 will be amended in the coming months. Currently, we have 4 opinions pending, 4 proposals from the EASA to the European Commission pending for an amendment of Part 21. The 2 big ones really focusing on changes of Part 21 are the first one, Opinion 7/2016 on level of involvement, and the last one, Opinion 9 from last year on Cape 10 environmental requirements implementing the latest changes in the SARPs, in the standard and recommended practices in ICAO Annex 16. I also put 2 other opinions on this slide. I put them in brackets here. The one on aging aircraft and maintenance check flights. These 2 opinions that we've submitted, these 2 proposals that we've made, are not primarily targeting Part 21 changes. The aging aircraft is targeting the retrospective application, so Part 26 of rules that already exist in CS25. And the maintenance check flights predominantly target the OPS regulation, so Regulation 965. But both regulations have 1, respectively 2 provisions that will also amend Part 21. So just that you will be, or that you are aware of them. So what's the status on these 4 opinions? I've been just last Friday to Brussels. The Commission last Friday discussed 3 out of these 4 proposals: level of involvement, Cape 10, and maintenance check flights. They discussed these proposals with the member states in the member states expert groups. We have now a draft Part 21 amendment, a regulatory text, a draft regulatory text that was submitted for comments to the member states experts. The member states had a first opportunity to comment on them last Friday. They will have now 2 weeks to further submit comments, and depending on how controversial these comments are, as of in 2 weeks, at the earliest, the Commission may start the adoption process for the amendment of Part 21. If there are comments that need to be reflected further, that maybe still require a couple of changes in the draft regulatory text, there may be a second round of consultation of the member states experts. But what I expect is that by the end of the year, we will have a final regulatory text that can be adopted or will be adopted by the European Commission. We still then need approximately 6 to 8 weeks for the translation process. And then the Commission will send this proposal to the Parliament and the Council for scrutiny. This will last 2 months. And after these 2 months, then the Part 21 amendment will be published in the official journal and will enter into force. So if everything is going well now in the coming 2 to 4 weeks, then what we can expect to see is to have the Part 21 amendment on level of involvement, on Cape 10, and the one provision related to maintenance check flights in force, maybe, let's say, in the month of April. That's how the realistic timeline looks like now. There may be one thing happening in the coming 2 weeks. It's not yet 100% clear whether the Commission will adopt one regulation with these 3 proposals, or within these half year, maybe 2 regulations amending Part 21. There is a timing issue related to the environmental requirements. So the Cape 10 proposal, it may be that the Commission accelerates this proposal and publishes and make it entering into force already towards the end of this year, early January, and the level of involvement and maintenance check flights may then come only in April. This is still under discussion. It was not 100% clarified last Friday, but within the coming 4 to 6 months, you will see 1 or 2 Part 21 amendments covering these 3 topics. The aging aircraft topic is still under discussion within the Commission. So there we still need a couple of meetings with the member states experts as well. I don't expect this to enter into force before the end of next year. And then what will happen next? What can you expect next? Also where we are seeking for your involvement, for your comments in our proposals. The first one is a decision that a lot of you are awaiting already since quite a long time. I think in my update last year, I already indicated that it may come up beginning of this year. We will publish in the coming weeks a decision amending the AMC and guidance material related to this rulemaking task 689, Part 21 proportionality, which will introduce in the organizational requirement part, subpart J and subpart G of Part 21, some AMCs and a number of guidance material for the lower end of GA to make the process, or to make the organization approval process less process-driven and more product and risk-driven. We will publish, hopefully still in the course of this week, the draft decision and send it to the advisory bodies for a last round of comments. And after this consultation of the advisory bodies, we will reflect those comments received. And then I expect beginning of next year, January, maybe early February, have the final decision published and in force. Then we have 3 other rulemaking tasks in the pipeline for which we recently concluded the consultation period. So the NPA was published on the website for your comments. The one on parts without Form 1, on level of involvement, a first set of AMC guidance material, and instructions for continued airworthiness. Currently, there's nothing on our website where you can comment on, no open NPA for consultation, but there are 2 consultations upcoming that you should be aware of and where we are seeking your input. The first one is on safety management systems. Later today, we are going to explain you a bit more on how this NPA, on how this first proposal looks like. And you can expect towards the end of this year a small NPA on level of involvement. We still have a couple of AMC and guidance material that we could not consult with you so far in the set of the first package, the NPA 2017-20, which we would like to consult with you towards the end of the year, so have one decision with all AMC and guidance material ready for LOI when the Part 21 amendment enters into force next year. So please follow our website and contribute to these 2 NPAs that are upcoming. Now I would like to go a little bit more into detail of some rulemaking tasks. The first one is the one parts without Form 1. I just mentioned that the consultation period of the NPA is closed. At the moment, we are reviewing your comments. The purpose of this rulemaking task was to find a way to install parts into the aircraft without having the need for an EASA Form 1, except for standard parts and raw material. So we had made a proposal in this NPA where we looked at the risk connected to that part, and we proposed a series of risk criteria, risk classification for risk criteria, and based on the risk, we proposed a way on how to either go with an EASA Form 1, other control mechanisms, or no control mechanism at all. We received a lot of comments on that proposal, and most of you commented that the system of the 4 classification criteria is too complicated. So we are at the moment reviewing these. We may end up with less criteria, maybe only 2, maybe 3. We are discussing this in the rulemaking group or review group, how it's now named after the NPA, and we will develop the proposal for an opinion to the European Commission, which you can see is targeted at the moment for the Q3 of next year. We already received comments that if we change the criteria, then we should go for a second round of comments. So we are considering that as well. So you may receive a second NPA or a consultation of the advisory bodies on our new proposal before we publish the opinion to the European Commission. On SMS, I will not say much here. You will have a detailed presentation after lunch. Just highlighting here the timelines because I will not repeat them in this detail later. So as you can see, we are shortly before the publication of the NPA. We plan to publish this still this quarter, still before the end of the year. And in our EPAS, in the draft rulemaking program, you can see, or you will see, that we target the proposal to the European Commission, the opinion, beginning of 2020, which can mean that Part 21 change is in force somewhere in 2021, towards end 2021. Rulemaking task 252 on instructions for continued airworthiness. The idea here was to establish clear requirements and responsibilities for all parties involved in the ICA process. We had previously this year concluded one of the subtasks which were just targeting a change to CS25, and we submitted earlier this year the proposal, the NPA, to you for your comments on the changes to Part 21. We are currently reviewing these comments. We just started reviewing these comments, so actually today I cannot tell you much about the comments that we receive and where your main concerns or your main areas of comments are. The timeline for this rulemaking task is, again, Q3 2019. So you'll see we try to maintain a parallelism between the Parts Without Form 1 task and the ICA task, so that we will do one proposal to the European Commission amending Part 21 in respect to these two rulemaking activities. Then we have level of involvement. Last year, during this workshop, we dedicated almost a full morning to explain you what we had in mind with this rulemaking task. Currently, we are at the stage where the rule change will be adopted, may be adopted by the European Commission soon. As mentioned in my introduction, we can expect to have this rule change into Part 21 in place, in force, maybe in April, my good guess, in April of next year. Not only covering level of involvement, just keep in mind, this proposal already includes the possibility for an approved design organization to apply for new privileges for certain major changes, major repairs, STCs. So this is something that you will see coming up in Part 21 very soon. A first NPA was already consulted, and as I mentioned before, towards the end of the year or early next year, we will launch a short second NPA with some additional AMCs and guidance material that we think are necessary to apply level of involvement properly. And the last rulemaking task that I would like to mention here is the one where I mentioned that we are just about to finalize the ED decision, so the adoption of the AMC and guidance material on Part 21 proportionality. Initially, we had planned two phases for this rulemaking task. A phase one addressing the AMCs and guidance material, and a second phase addressing the rules themselves, Part 21. But for Part 21, at a certain point in time, we realized that we will have a lot of proposals in the new Basel regulation that will help us to bring more scalability into Part 21, especially for design organizations and production organizations. So we put this second phase a bit on hold, and we have now cancelled this second phase, and we fully integrated this activity in a new rulemaking task, which has the number 727, which is implementing the new Basel regulation, and which I will introduce to you in a minute. So currently, what you will see is a decision bringing in a set of AMCs and guidance material addressed to design organizations and production organizations involved in low-risk products, trying to get a bit away from the process orientation that is in Part 21 and in the AMC and guidance material today, and providing you with means to comply with the Part 21 requirements that are a bit more proportionate, a bit more scalable to the activities you are conducting, to the risks that are involved with your products. So please follow our website, and I hope latest beginning of the year you can start using these AMC and guidance material. And this is an overview of all the rulemaking tasks that are ongoing related to Part 21. I hope it's kind of readable, but you will have the slides available. But you can see that there are a number of rulemaking tasks ongoing that will address Part 21 changes. What I would like, or the message that I would like to give you here is just be aware of a certain parallelism of rulemaking tasks. I already mentioned what you can see in red, the two opinions that are planned for next year, where we try to publish one proposal on Parts Without Form 1 and ICA, Instruction for Continuing Airworthiness, one opinion to the European Commission addressing both rulemaking tasks. You can also see in the green bit here that with the blue star, that's the upcoming Part 21 change that I mentioned earlier this morning. After the Commission has amended Part 21 with regard to LOI, Cape 10 and maintenance check flights, we will issue the related AMC and guidance material. So you can see one decision, you will see one decision addressing these three rulemaking activities in one go. shortly before, maybe even if it's in timely possible, maybe even we will include the Part 21 proportionality AMC and guidance material in that one decision, aiming at reducing the number of decisions that you will have to implement in your system. It's not very useful if every month or every 3 months we publish a new decision with new AMC and guidance material. And in yellow, you can see the 4 upcoming NPAs, the proposals that we will submit to you for consultation, and getting a bit of an idea of when they are planned. So we will have a proposal upcoming related to the certified category of drones, which is the 4th line from the top, Rulemaking Task 230. Later this morning you will get a dedicated presentation on what we are doing with drones. One element for the certified category will also invoke changes to Part 21. I mentioned the SMS, NPA earlier, and the level of involvement. And in the second line, I would like to bring to your attention, we have a regular update task for the AMCs and guidance material that we run once a year, once every 2 years, depending on the number of topics we have, where we address non-controversial, non-complex, mature topics for the AMC and guidance material. And we had received a number of proposals from you, collected from ASD in particular, addressed quite a number of things that were inconsistent in the AMC and guidance material today. That is a task that we plan for mid-next year to publish a proposal on quite a number of changes to the AMC and guidance material that do not fall into one of these specific topics that I mentioned before. That was my proposal. So I suggest we break here for coffee. You can digest this bit a little bit, and then I will come back on stage after coffee, and I will present to you this new rulemaking task, what we have in mind, how to implement the changes from the new basic regulation into Part 21.
And thanks, Michael, and we will... All the questions that we receive, we will address after the coffee break. The coffee break was planned for 30 minutes, but due to the delay, can we make it to 20 minutes, please? Thank you.
10 nach, bitte, also in 20 Minuten. Können die wieder bitte einen Gong raushauen?
Okay, can we continue, please? Please take your seats. I'm just looking for Michael. Okay.
Push your blood pressure a bit. So I will slowly start while you're getting seated. So the last topic that I want to address today in this presentation is following up on Michaela's introduction of what has changed generically in the new basic regulation. How are we going to implement this into Part 21? You have already seen from Michaela's presentation that there are a couple of things the agency has to prepare for. One of many of those is rulemaking. We have to assess the existing implementing rules, including Part 21, whether they require an update, considering some of the new concepts that are brought into the new basic regulation, considering the amendments of existing concepts. And we have listed all of these activities that we think are necessary based on the new basic regulation, and the rulemaking activity for Part 21 came up quite high on the priority list. So we already decided to launch a new rulemaking activity. You're going to see that in the EASA that we will finalize for the end of the year. You see this new rulemaking activity with the number 727 that I mentioned before, which is addressing some, not all of the amendments from the new basic regulation to be implemented in Part 21. And I'm going to show you, I would like to show you what we have in mind. We're still at the very beginning. We are still having a number of internal discussions to set the scope of this rulemaking activities. You also have not yet seen the terms of reference. You will see that later, probably beginning of next year. But I would like also already to introduce to you of what we have in mind. So where are we today? We have Part 21 in place, shortly being updated with the LOI-related proposal, and since 11th of September 2018, on the right-hand side, we have the new basic regulation. We already know, and that was one big part that we discussed under this old rulemaking task 609, Part 21 proportionality, that some of the Part 21 requirements which exist today are not always scaled to the risk of the products designed or produced. So we need to bring in more proportionality in the rules already. We wanted to do that under this old rulemaking task, but as we now have quite a number of new tools which were not existing in the old basic regulation, but which are now available under the new basic regulation, we decided to merge this activity into this new rulemaking task. So one big element of this new rulemaking task will be proportionality, more scalability of Part 21. In addition, this new basic regulation also introduced and demands existing concepts that are in Part 21. I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a minute. And we have to revisit Part 21 and see what changes are necessary to the existing Part 21 because something has changed in the basic regulation. And actually, that is the scope of this new rulemaking task 727 that we are, or have just launched, are about to launch. The part that Michaela skipped this morning, I will therefore go a bit more into detail. If you, just neutrally, this is not yet about the new rulemaking task 727. Here, I just captured a couple of points from the new basic regulation that may or may not affect Part 21. They're just without any order, hierarchy. Just on this slide and the next slide, I've put 8 or 9 statements from the new basic regulation where we need to consider, think whether we need to, as a consequence, change Part 21. So one is that the requirements shall be, where possible, be performance-based and objective-based and allow different means of achieving compliance. We know that Part 21 is not perfect in this respect, and that is one of the big topics that we want to address with this new rulemaking task. Requirements shall be proportionate to the risk. Operation, open to public, third party on the ground, complexity of aircraft, persons affected, and the ability to assess the risk. Statements from the new base regulation. Also there we need to see whether Part 21 considers these objectives already or whether we have to fine-tune it a bit. The new basic regulation now offers a possibility for approved organizations to issue, under a privilege, type certificates. Changes and repairs or OSD approvals is maybe not such a breakthrough, but there is a possibility, if we implement that in Part 21, that an approved organization may even issue a type certificate under a privilege, something that doesn't exist in Part 21 today. Another new concept is that there is now a possibility that an engine does not need to have a separate TC. The engine can be TC'd as part of the aircraft TC. Also that, to Part 21, is not possible today. 21A23 says that if that's the case, if the engine has not its own TC, we can only issue a restricted type certificate to the aircraft. So we have to review these provisions in order to implement this new possibility under the basic regulation. Most of you have already heard and have probably a number of questions of what this new concept of non-installed equipment is. What is non-installed equipment? And what does it mean that it can be certified? So this is something new that doesn't exist today. It was introduced in the new basic regulation. It says that non-installed equipment shall be open for certification. Also there, Part 21 is empty on this today. We need to implement something there if we want to apply this principle from the basic regulation. If you look at the provisions for the restricted certificate of airworthiness and the permit to fly in the old basic regulation and in Part 21 today, and if you compare that to Article 18 or 19 of the basic regulation today, you see that the conditions for issuing a restricted CFA have changed totally. Basically, we can only in the future issue a restricted CFA if there's a restricted TC. The concept of specific airworthiness specifications thus has gone. It's deleted from the basic regulation. So we need to see how we are going to reflect that in Part 21 in the future. An organization approval is not always necessarily required if the risk is low, and an organization can also declare its capability. So today we have the scalability with the DOA, the alternative procedures, and the certification program in 21A14. This opens a wider toolbox for the organization approval, and even you may be eligible for designing or producing a product without being approved, by just making a declaration that you are compliant. Something that we need to reflect in Part 21. It doesn't exist today. The compliance with the essential requirements for airworthiness, the old Annex 1, the new Annex 2 of the basic regulation, can be demonstrated in the future without issuing a certificate. So also there, compliance with the essential requirements, with the airworthiness requirements, can be possible by using a declaration instead of getting a certificate from an authority. Part 21 is empty on that today. We have a new annex in the basic regulation for environmental essential requirements. Today, or in the old basic regulation, for environmental requirements, we one-to-one refer to the ICAO Annex 16. Now we have the possibility for additional essential requirements. I'm going to explain you how far that goes. And we have to implement that, also in terms of CSs, for example. And there are a number of definitions and terminology that has changed. For example, we don't use approvals anymore. It's all certificates. We don't use the term appliance anymore. It's all parts. We have the new concept of non-installed equipment, NIE. We have a declaration next to a certificate. So you see there's quite a lot of things. This list is not exhaustive, just a couple of things, highlights I would say, that we have to consider, and we have to see what we need to change in Part 21, how we are going to do that, and when we are going to do that. And from these topics, what we've picked, or what we plan to pick for this new rulemaking task 7 to 7, which is the first wave of new things to change in Part 21, is we are pretty clear that we want to address two topics. The first one is the simple and proportionate rules for general aviation. We also have a specific political statement in the basic regulation in Article 140 that this is one of the most important changes introduced with the new basic regulation to bring more proportionality, and there's an obligation on the agency to develop an opinion for sports and leisure aviation within 2 years to the European Commission. That's actually how we are going to implement what we're going to do with this rulemaking task. A second topic that we want to address is this new concept for non-installed equipment. And then there are a couple of other things. I'm not going to repeat them. You will make the link to what I've mentioned on the previous 2 slides, which we are considering at the moment. It's not yet sure whether we will include it in the scope. So you may, then in the terms of reference, later see what from these topics we also want to address. Important statement, no, I don't have it here. Important statement is that this rulemaking task 7 to 7 will definitely not implement everything that has changed in the new basic regulation at once. So we will focus on some aspects, the 2 ones on top here, plus maybe some of those which I put here under consideration, and the rest will come later, maybe starting in 2 to 3 years to develop the rulemaking activities. What I would like to show you in a bit more detail today is on 3 of these topics: the proportionate rules for general aviation, the non-installed equipment, and the environmental requirements, on what our first considerations are on how we can implement these. I would like to focus on these 3 topics now. I've prepared 1 slide for each. For the Part 21 proportionality, we can really base our considerations on a lot of work that has been done by the rulemaking group under this old rulemaking task 689, Part 21 proportionality. A lot of discussions already happened there. We were just lacking the tool to really implement it. So what we have in mind is to redraft Part 21 or to add something to Part 21 that considers the various risk factors that are involved in the design and production of the aircraft. This critical sentence at the second part here that is not disconnected from these existing Part 21 requirements is probably one of the biggest challenges we have. We have to see whether we include these more proportionate rules for the lower end of GA directly into the existing Part 21 requirements, which then means really different requirements, different concepts to large aircraft versus general aviation aircraft, or whether we pull them apart and in the future are going to live with 2 Part 21s, I would say. Consideration that we are having at the moment internally. Then we need to insert a differentiation of products based on the perceived risks. But at the same time, we know or we already see that we cannot only focus on the product itself, let's say on the mass, on the weight of the aircraft, like we do that until today. We also have to look at some operational issues on the risks that are actually linked to the aircraft that is designed or produced. So an important element will also be the boundaries between the subcategories. Something that we also learned in the context of this, the rulemaking task on CS23, which we reorganized and put very much on an objective-based level. That we have to be clear that the boundaries between the different subcategories are consistent, that we capture everything, and we do not create new barriers that then in the end will require us to change the rules again. In order to bring in this objective-based, risk-based approach into Part 21 for general aviation, for leisure and sports activities, we can use quite a number of the new tools that is now offered in the toolbox of the new basic regulation. I mentioned before the possibility of declarations. So we will consider that instead of an organization approval, the design or production organization declares its capabilities. The same may happen, declaration of compliance for a product instead of a certificate for a product. We will also look more into existing industry standards, especially looking at the processes on how you design or produce your products. If existing and acceptable to us, we may recognize them much more than we do it today through an AMC. If you follow the industry standard, then this is an acceptable means of compliance. We're going to address that, or we consider to address this more in Part 21. And it's not only about rulemaking. So we also need to provide you, the authorities, us, with more safety promotional material, explanation, templates, guidance material, checklists, handbooks. So we try to develop this in parallel, a rule change and promotional material that facilitates the application of the new future rules. Non-installed equipment. It's something new. Today, it's not in the basic regulation, it's not in Part 21. It's a new concept that was developed because there was a need, I'm going to explain that in a second to you, because there was a need identified based on the current system of parts and appliances. I've put here on the slide the definition of what non-installed equipment is. Article 3.29 of the new basic regulation. Non-installed equipment means any equipment carried on board of an aircraft by the operator, first important point, which is not a part, second important point, and which is used or intended to be used in operating or controlling an aircraft, or supporting the occupant's survivability, or which could impact the safe operation of the aircraft. So 3 requirements: on board, carried by the operator, not a part, and then one of the 3 criteria that you see at the end of the sentence. And if you have such a non-installed equipment, the new basic regulation opens the door to get a certificate, specific certificate for this non-installed equipment. The examples that were used in the drafting process of the new basic regulation, the pictures are not as clear as I would like them to be, were basically emergency parachutes, electronic flight bags, and cargo tracking devices. These are devices that are not part of the type design, that can or is flexible to use between different designs, between different types of aircraft. So the ETSO pass under parts and appliances was not open for these kind of equipment. But we received from you the wish to address them through a specific certificate. So the idea was to create, next to parts and appliances, a new category of non-installed equipment and also allow this to be certified. A bit of complication in the system that makes it today a bit difficult to understand. The idea behind is that in the development process of the new basic regulation, what is today parts and appliances has also changed. You will not find the term appliances back in the basic regulation, and we will delete it from Part 21. The idea of the regulator in the basic regulation was we do not really make a difference between parts and appliances. There are no different legal consequences attached, be it either a part or an appliances, so we only need one term. So what used to be parts and appliances in the future is part. And the definition that you'll find in the new basic regulation is a part is everything that is part of the type design. And that's also why it's important to differentiate the non-installed equipment from the parts. So please don't understand the fact, or please don't understand that the non-installed equipment is a replacement for appliances because it has disappeared. That's not the case, and that's not the intent. So we now, if we want to implement that into Part 21, we have to develop a totally new certification process. Our first considerations are, there's of course a possibility to develop something similar like the ETS-OA process for parts. So we could come up with something that looks very similar, maybe has a different name, maybe it's even part of that. We have no solution for that, we have no conclusion for that. It could look like that. It could be a totally separate certification process that doesn't remind at all on ETS-OA. According to the Part 21 principles, you also see that there is a need for an organizational approval for the organizations producing and designing and producing non-installed equipment. So we also have to develop some eligibility criteria. And also the basic regulation also links one of the proportionality tools, which is the use of declaration of compliance instead of issuing an authorization or approval to it. So we also have to bring in this proportionality. It's not necessarily an approval from the agency or not necessarily an authorization like ETS-OA. It could also be a declaration of compliance from the designer of such a non-installed equipment. We have to see, these are very first considerations, but it will go in this direction. And then a couple of words on the third element, the environmental requirements. In the new basic regulation, we will continue the old concept. The essential requirements for environmental compatibility are those contained in ICAO Annex 16, but new basic regulation will add something which is then contained in Annex 3 for the case to the extent that there is nothing, there's no environmental standard, there's no environmental requirement in ICAO Annex 16, which happens sometimes today. Then today we cannot apply any essential requirements. In the future, we can then go back to the essential requirements in Annex 3 and build the certification basis based on what is existing in Annex 16 plus where something is missing there, the essential requirements from Annex 16. For that, we have to implement this Annex 3 of the basic regulation into Part 21. We have to totally revisit what today is 21A18, establishment of the environmental requirements. Today we designate the environmental requirement in Annex 16. That is part of the third basis. In the future, we may end up with something like the type certification basis, where you pick from Annex 16 or Annex 3 the specification that is applicable, maybe complement this with a special condition, and then have your environmental certification basis, which today is not possible in Part 21, so we consider to change it in this direction. You also see that there are a lot of concepts in Part 21 which are only linked to safety. Also those we will have to open to environmental compatibility, so a number of other provisions are also considered to be changed. You see, it's a lot of activities and we still have to define the scope and what to pick there. I mentioned before the target that we have in 2020, which is embedded in the basic regulation, Article 140. The basic regulation requires us to present a proposal to the European Commission on proportionality aspects for leisure and sports activities within 2 years after the entry into force, so 11th of September 2020. That is governing the timeline that you see here. The non-installed equipment, the environmental aspects are not subject to that timeline, but if we include it in this rulemaking activity, we will try to maintain this timeline for all the proposals that we are discussing and coming up in the context of this rulemaking activities. At the moment, we are in a conceptual phase. We are defining the scope of the activity. As you saw, we consider which of these elements we already implement now. We plan to publish in terms of reference, and before that, of course, consult with the advisory bodies, beginning of next year. And then we have a bit more than 1.5 years, where I just put here consultation of stakeholders and the public in a most suitable manner. So we have not yet decided on how to best involve you, but I can imagine that depending on the topics we pick, we use different methods of consulting you. For some of the topics, I probably need a wide consultation of the public. I need all of your views. When it comes to the Part 21 proportionality aspects, I consider that it's maybe more appropriate to invite those affected companies in a workshop or a series of workshops and develop the proposal with their support without publishing an NPA. Our rulemaking procedure has a couple of tools that we can use, and we will pick the ones which are most suitable to the specific topic, considering the time constraints that we have if we want to meet this 2 years timeline. Then the proposal will be discussed by the European Commission. They involve the member states, as what you know from the past, the comitology procedures. It will be now an experts group discussing the proposal, and then about, let's say, a year, 1.5 years later, we can expect Part 21 to be amended with the topics that we are going to propose as part of this rulemaking activity. So consider something like 2022 when the new basic regulation will have been implemented, at least the first bit, into Part 21. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Michael. Just a few comments. We have also microphones in the room, so if you want to ask a question live, just wave your hand and then somebody or the colleagues will come up to you. For those following us on YouTube, the Slido code that you need to enter to be able to also submit questions from outside is DOA. And I will repeat that on a regular basis because it wasn't published on the website. So if you're following us on YouTube and you want to ask questions on a Slido, enter DOA and then you should have access to it. We got plenty of questions for Michael and still some for Michaela. Maybe to start with some of them, the non-installed equipment is raising a lot of issues. For example, do they need a Form 1?
We have not started to consider that. It's one of the elements we need to discuss, but there's no answer to that one yet.
There was a question on the rulemaking task 18, parts without Form 1, that a TC holder could classify parts. The question is whether STC holders could have the same possibility.
Yes, that's my understanding. The privilege, or there will be a privilege for this classification in 263, so it's open for all approved design organizations. And if I remember correctly, there's also one point added in subpart J 307 or 308, which then lists all the cases, and it refers, if I remember correctly, to the design approval, so including STCs. Yeah, I would say yes.
Okay, question from the floor. Is anybody? Nobody wants to ask a question, okay. So everything seems to be very clear. Okay, continue with a few questions we received. With all these new concepts under Part 21, how is it aligned with other parts, the risk evaluation definition between certification and ops rules, for example?
Yes, absolutely. We need to work more in that direction. The rulemaking activity on drones that we're going to introduce you next is a good example that when we develop the design specifications and the design approval process, we always need to pay attention on the way how the aircraft in the end is being operated. Today, we have a couple of examples where the ops rules and the airworthiness rules are not consistent, but we'll take this into consideration, everything that we're going to do in the future. And the Part 21 proportionality task is one good example where we have to do that, yes.
Okay, there was one question whether there will be online courses offered like for the new basic regulation also for these topics.
Yeah, we are not yet there, but definitely. So we will prepare training courses much closer to when it's clear how the rule looks like. So definitely after we have submitted our proposal to the European Commission, we will develop training courses. We will, like we did for LOI last year here, we may use an opportunity like this one to in detail explain to you what are the ideas behind these proposals. Yeah.
And we have one other question for the non-installed equipment. That was about the installation requirements for this equipment.
Because we are talking about non-installed equipment, I don't see the need for that, different from the ETSO process, so from the parts today, where the installation is subject to the design approval holder. Here, when we have non-installed equipment, we will look at the specification mobs of the non-installed equipment, but not at the installation.
In the meantime, anybody brave enough to ask the first question from the floor? Yes, perfect. One second, there's somebody with a microphone coming. And if you could please state your name and company.
Okay, this is Segah Özdemir from Turkish Aerospace. And my question is, will there be a criteria for EASA to accept the declaration of organization that they are capable of something? What is the idea behind this new regulation? Could you please explain a little more?
The idea there is to bring in more proportionality, more scalability. So if the risk of the activity that the organization is conducting is considered not to be very high, then it may be sufficient that they declare their capabilities, and then, as of course, under the oversight of the competent authority. So if they have made a wrong declaration, then the activity has to stop. The competent authority has to take the necessary enforcement actions. And the competent authority will continuously supervise and monitor the activities, but then we refrain from having this approval process before they can start their activities. So it's a risk-based proportionality consideration.
There's one more question for Michaela, maybe, from the previous presentation. And it's about whether somebody can skip the local authority and go to a different member state, so shopping between authorities, or go directly to EASA for design changes under the new basic regulation.
Well, not really. There is only one case. I explained to you that there is one type of opt-in, the opt-in in relation to certain types of Annex 1 aircraft, so the opt-in for microlights, when it is possible for the organization to decide itself to apply directly to EASA for a type certificate. But in all other cases of the opt-ins and opt-outs, it is up to the member state to actually decide to do this opt-in or opt-out. There is another case where the initiative also relies in the organization, which I didn't go into so much detail, but it is one of the possibilities related to the transfer of responsibilities. So the new basic regulation foresees that in certain cases for what is called like multinational organization, so basically an organization that either has one principal place of business in a member state, but extensive facilities or personnel located in other member states, or a grouping of organizations with different principal places of business, but that are working together as a group, that it is possible for such a multinational organization to decide that it would rather have EASA as its competent authority than the member states. But in this case, there is the possibility for this organization to initiate a request that EASA becomes its competent authority. But in this case, this needs to be discussed with EASA and the member states involved, and it requires the consent of the member state. So I'm afraid that it's not just that any organization can now just go ahead and choose which competent authority it wants. A lot of the restrictions that existed before continue to exist.
Okay, thanks, Michaela. And I think with that, it's time to move to the next presentation. Natalia De Rubio to brief us on ARPA's initial airworthiness.
Good morning. So my name is Natalia Di Rubio. I'm the rulemaking officer here in EASA, and I'm responsible for coordinating